Grief is not a one-size-fits-all experience. It's actually a complex and multifaceted experience, and it can manifest in many different forms depending on the individual and the situation. So let's walk together and I'll share with you some ways to navigate the type or types of grief you're experiencing the most. Hey friend, welcome back to Grief Questions Answered. I'm Eric, and it's my goal with these videos to share everything that I've learned about how to survive, find support in the loneliness of grief, and how to intentionally get back up and live beyond the loss of a loved one. If this grief tip doesn't help you today, I am confident it can and will help you at some point in the future, so be sure to save this video to watch later on. Today's question comes from Michelle, who asked me, what type of grief do I have? Now, Michelle and I were talking the other day on a coaching call about her recent experience of loss. You see, she lost her parent, and she said that this type of grief felt different from losing her husband many years ago. And it got me thinking about the various types of grief that we can experience on this journey. And I know for me, when I lost my 15-year-old daughter Zoe back in 2014, it wasn't just complicated grief, it was also traumatic and prolonged. Now, for some of us, this experience can be only one type of grief, but in reality, we're most likely going to experience a combination of different types of grief as we navigate the day-to-day on this journey and as we're trying to heal. So I'd like to share with you the following 12 types of grief that you may experience, and then I'm going to share with you some ways to help yourself no matter what you're feeling and going through. And if you feel like any of these resonate with you as I talk about them in this video, be sure to comment below and tell me what did connect with you and how you potentially navigated that part of your journey with that particular type of grief. So the first type of grief that we're going to talk about today is called absent grief. Now, what this means is that some people may show no outward signs of grieving, and they may appear to be unaffected by their loss, but this can be a defense mechanism or a sign of numbness. Sometimes this is also called inhibited grief, where externally you may look okay to others, but internally you're falling apart and you just don't want anybody to know. And another term that is also used for this type of absent grief is called masked grief. Now, when you're feeling this type of grief, you may not realize that your behaviors or emotions are linked to a loss. You might experience anger and anxiety or physical ailments like phantom pains, but you're not connecting them with the grief that you're experiencing. The next type of grief could be ambiguous grief, and this is where there's no one to bury, and so the loss for all intents and purposes is unresolved. An example could be like a soldier that is lost to war on foreign soil or at sea. Their remains never come home, so it's really hard to get closure on this type of loss. And I've heard of widows who were given notice that their husband was lost in war or at sea or some other accident, and the body was never recovered. And this type of grief may hold the delusion that they may walk through your door one day. And some hold on to this until the day that they die, even many decades after the actual loss takes place. The next is anticipatory grief, and this type of grief occurs before a significant loss happens, such as when a loved one is terminally ill. And people may begin grieving in anticipation of the loss, often experiencing the emotions associated with the grief before the actual event. And if you remember, a couple of months ago, I came in here and talked about learning of my mom's stage 4 ovarian cancer diagnosis, and now our entire family is in anticipatory grief right now. And so to navigate this type of grief, it's important to connect with a coach or a counselor who's trained in not only being able to help you process your anticipatory grief, but as your post-loss grief as well. The next type of grief is called complicated grief. And this type of grief is often also associated with prolonged grief, and it's an intense and it prevents a person from moving forward in life. It may involve some severe emotional pain, difficulty in accepting the loss, and persistent longing for the one you've lost. And complicated grief may require professional help to address. And similar to complicated grief is prolonged grief, where it's like this, over a long period of time, you have no improvement. You can remain stuck in your grief and unable to return to your normal life. When I lost my marriage back in 2004, this was a hugely prolonged grief experience for me. It took me over 3 years to get over that loss. And when I lost my daughter 7 years later, I already had some tools to apply to this loss, but I still needed some additional tools, especially after losing her to suicide. Now, the fifth type of grief is collective grief. This occurs when a community or a society or even the world grieves together. And this could be because of a significant event or a natural disaster. Like, for example, in 2001, the United States came together after 9/11. We all grieved. We all felt the collective nature of this because it affected each of us in our own way. From a perspective of a public figure, when John Lennon was killed in 1981, a lot of people grieved his loss because they were connected with his music and they felt a love for him. And so it's real. That grief is real. Now, cumulative grief happens when multiple losses occur in a short period of time, and this can lead to some overwhelming feelings. The person may struggle to cope with this compounded pain. And a few weeks ago, I did answer a question about what do we do when we experience multiple losses. Because when these losses happen in a short period of time, it can make it feel like our grief is just not going to ever stop. Now, the seventh type of grief is delayed grief. And in some cases, this may be where somebody doesn't experience grief after the loss, and instead, the emotions may emerge later on, which are often triggered by another event or some sort of stressor. In fact, one of my coaching clients lost their partner last summer. When we started working together, they were actually focused on some other elements of their life that felt like they sidelined their grief. But then a few months later, when the other elements were resolved, the grief from their original loss of losing their partner hit them like a brick wall. And the analogy that I use here is that your focus actually turns towards those other stressors, and it's like you're holding up a shield to protect yourself. And when those stressors are resolved, the shield comes down, and then the grief comes flowing in, and it hits you really hard. So the next type of grief is disenfranchised grief. Now, this type of grief occurs when a loss is not acknowledged or validated by those around you. So something like this could be like the death of an ex-partner or a pet or a relationship that society doesn't see as significant. But it can also occur when circumstances are stigmatized, such as a suicide or the loss because of an addiction. And this is where people from the outside make assumptions about your loss, and they minimize your grief so that they can try to speed you through the process or tell you how to grieve. And look, this is probably one of the most difficult types of grief to deal with. Why? Because there really is no timeline for grief. There is no one right way to navigate this path except for the one way that works for you. It's on your pace, on your time, and on your agenda only, okay? Now, the next type of grief is exaggerated grief. And this is when the grief occurs when you're not only dealing with the loss of your loved one, you're also losing other things associated with them. An example of this could be maybe your parents got a divorce when you were little, and then one of your parents remarried, and when they died, their current partner was bequeathed or given the entire estate, and you were left with nothing. It could also be that you lost your loved one and the home you were living in at the same time. And this can also be known as secondary loss grief, meaning that after a significant loss, there can be additional things that you lose related to the primary event, such as maybe even losing your own identity or security or a lifestyle that you were used to. And grieving these secondary losses can be just as challenging as the primary loss. Now, the next type of grief is normal grief, and this is uncomplicated grief. This is our natural response to a loss, and it involves the emotions like going through those emotions like sadness and anger and confusion. And over time, the intensity of these emotions typically decreases as you're healing. The next type of grief is traumatic grief. Now, this is an emotional, psychological, and physiological response to a death that you're not prepared for. In this case, you may not have the coping skills to deal with this type of loss. And this type of grief is resolved through a combination of modalities of therapy, like traditional CBT or trauma resolution therapy, and even doing your own purposeful work. When I lost my daughter Zoe, that was in a traumatic way. She took her life. I found her. And I've had to use several modalities to kind of help me through that traumatic loss and that traumatic grief. Now, the last type of grief is time-bound grief. This is where you believe that after a certain period of time, you will feel better. And my friend, if I've learned anything about this grief journey, it's this, and that is that time is not the driver of your grief journey, it is a companion. If you fully hand over your grief to time in order to heal, you'll actually be waiting for something that's never coming to help you. Because there really is no one else coming to help you. It's up to you. But the good news is that you're not alone. Now, with each of these 12 areas of grief, it is important to connect with and work with a grief coach or a counselor who can help you navigate any combination of grief that you're connected with. Because when we do that, they can help you identify what's blocking you from processing your grief, but in a way where you feel heard, acknowledged, and supported fully, which is really what we need on this journey. So I'd like you to tell me below which of these 12 types of grief you're not only experiencing right now, but may have experienced in the past. And it's most likely going to be a combination of at least 2 of these. So as always, I hope this helps. Do you have a question about grief that I can answer for you? Let me know in the comments below. And if you haven't done so yet, click that subscribe button, as that is one of the best ways to get notified of new videos just like this and to show support for the channel. So let's continue to walk together, and I'll see you in next week's video.